December 1942, high above the Solomon Islands, 19-year-old waist gunner Eddie Kowalski braces himself inside the rumbling belly of a B-17. His hands clutch the grips of a Browning M2 that kicks and bucks like a living thing. Out of the gray sky, a Japanese Zero cuts across his 10 o'clock, 300 yards away, slicing through the air with predatory grace. Instinct takes over. Eddie steadies the sights on the enemy's fuselage and pulls the trigger. 50 rounds roar into the open sky, streaking orange across the clouds. Every tracer flashes harmlessly behind the Zero's tail. The enemy pilot doesn't flinch, doesn't weave, just glides on, untouchable as Eddie's ammo counter ticks toward Zero. It wasn't Eddie's fault. Scenes like his unfolded countless times across every front of the war. American gunners, disciplined, determined, and armed with some of the best weapons ever built, were still missing their marks. Not occasionally, but almost always. In early 1943, the Army Air Forces launched a detailed study, examining gun camera footage from bomber raids across Europe and the Pacific. The findings were devastating. Even highly trained aerial marksmen were landing hits less than 4% of the time on crossing targets. 4%. Out of every 100 rounds fired at an enemy plane sweeping across their sights, 96 vanished into empty sky. The math was unforgiving. A dogfight rarely lasted more than 8 to 12 seconds before the enemy slipped away or darted out of range. The Browning M2 spat out about 800 rounds per minute, roughly 13 each second. In a 10-second burst, a gunner could unleash around 130 rounds. Yet with only a 4% success rate, perhaps 5 would find their mark. 5 hits, barely enough to scratch a Zero, let alone bring down a rugged machine like the Focke-Wulf FW-190. German and Japanese fighters were notorious for soaking up streams of .50 caliber fire and still staying aloft. The toll in human life was overwhelming. Throughout 1943, the 8th Air Force over Europe averaged the loss of 188 bombers every month. Each B-17 carried 10 crewmen. Nearly 1,900 airmen killed, captured, or vanished every 30 days. Many of those casualties came from formations unable to fend off enemy fighters despite their best efforts. The gunners followed their training to the letter, steady tracking, perfect sight alignment, disciplined bursts. Their failure wasn't born of fear or inexperience. It was born of immutable laws of motion. Physics, indifferent to valor, rendered courage and precision powerless in the face of cold, unforgiving reality. A Browning M2's bullet left the barrel at nearly 2,900 feet per second, blisteringly fast by any measure. At close range against slow-moving targets, it might as well have been instantaneous. But in the skies of World War II, close meant 200 to 400 yards, and the targets were anything but slow. A Japanese Zero flying at 300 miles per hour streaked through the air at roughly 440 feet per second. Over a 300-yard shot, about 900 feet, the bullet took just over 0.3 of a second to reach its mark. It doesn't sound like much, yet in that sliver of time, the Zero had already surged ahead another 136 feet, about the length of 11 cars. The gunner fired at where the plane was, not where it would be, and the bullet tore harmlessly through the space the fighter had occupied a heartbeat earlier. This challenge had a name: deflection error. Military theorists had grasped it long before World War II, yet knowing it in theory and applying it under fire were worlds apart. The correction wasn't subtle, it was drastic and counterintuitive. Against an enemy crossing at 90 degrees, 300 yards away, a gunner had to lead the shot by 15 to 20 feet, aiming at nothing but empty sky. The target would intersect the bullets only if the gunner trusted the calculations completely. Every instinct, every natural reflex urged the opposite. Gunnery instructors worked tirelessly to teach deflection shooting, but success was rare. At the Army Air Force's Flexible Gunnery School in Laredo, Texas, students faced grueling training from 1942 onward. They spent countless hours in turret simulators, fired at towed targets for moving trucks, and studied charts illustrating proper lead angles. Yet, when combat came, theory fell apart. The challenge wasn't lack of effort. It was sheer complexity. Deflection wasn't a single, fixed calculation. It shifted constantly with target speed, approach angle, distance, altitude, and whether the enemy was climbing or diving. Add the movements of the gunner's own aircraft, and the variables multiplied. A B-17 ball turret gunner firing at a Messerschmitt Bf 109 in a head-on pass needed a vastly different lead than if the same fighter came across in a side-on beam attack. And he had mere seconds, 4 maybe, to calculate it all, while under fire, his bomber jolting from flak hits, oxygen mask fogging at 25,000 feet in the thin, freezing air. The mental challenge for gunners was as formidable as the mechanical one. Those who survived early sorties and attempted deflection shooting often abandoned it after perceived failure. They would aim ahead of a crossing aircraft, release a burst, and watch their tracers sail harmlessly through empty air, concluding they had overshot. In the next encounter, they instinctively reduced their lead, shifting their aim closer to the target's visible position. In doing so, they were unknowingly correcting in the wrong direction, trusting what they saw over the unseen laws of ballistics. Gun camera footage from 1943 repeatedly captures this cycle. An initial burst with proper forward lead, followed by subsequent shots that regress, until the gunner was aiming directly at or even slightly behind the enemy's current location, trapped by instinct and misperception. The losses were staggering. On October 1943 missions to Schweinfurt, the 8th Air Force recorded a 20% casualty rate, 60 bombers lost from 291 dispatched. Those that returned were battered, carrying dead and wounded crew, shredded hydraulic lines, and smoke-trailing engines. Debriefings revealed a familiar frustration. Gunners had fired relentlessly, their weapons functioning perfectly, yet their rounds rarely struck home. The situation demanded urgent change. At the ongoing attrition rate, the Allied bombing offensive risked collapse long before it could ever reach Berlin. Puckle's paper laid out the math with ruthless precision. He showed that once aircraft speed surpassed 150 miles per hour, the deflection angles needed for accurate fire went beyond human intuition. Against a target moving 250 miles per hour at a perpendicular angle, a gunner would have to aim 4 to 5 aircraft lengths ahead of where the enemy appeared. His work included detailed tables and exhaustive charts, calculating the required lead for every combination of speed, distance, and crossing angle. A 200-yard shot at a 90-degree crossing against a 300 miles per hour aircraft demanded a 47-foot lead. At 400 yards, it jumped to 94 feet. The figures were staggering, and Puckle's warning even grimmer. Without mechanical assistance, aerial gunners would soon be virtually ineffective. Yet the Army filed the paper away and promptly forgot it. Through the 1920s and 1930s, military aviation leapt forward, yet gunnery instruction clung stubbornly to World War I techniques. Trainees drilled on marksmanship fundamentals, sight alignment, trigger discipline, breath control, as if preparing for a static rifle range rather than a deadly three-dimensional pursuit at 300 miles per hour. Few instructors called for advanced deflection training, and their warnings were dismissed as exaggeration. After all, the argument went, Americans had a storied legacy of sharpshooting. Daniel Boone, Sergeant York, frontier marksman. Surely those instincts would carry into the skies. They did not. By December 1941, when the United States entered World War II, Army Air Force's gunnery training was woefully unprepared for modern aerial combat. The standard program lasted only 4 weeks. with each student firing roughly 1,000 rounds throughout the course. Most of that ammunition was spent on stationary targets or slow-moving sleeves, lumbering at perhaps 150 miles per hour along predictable paths. Not one exercise simulated the fury of a FW-190 diving through a bomber formation at 400 miles per hour while twisting in a barrel roll. Graduates earned their wings, boarded bombers bound for England or the Pacific, and quickly discovered that their training offered little advantage the moment a zero streaked across their sights. By mid-1942, desperate commanders scoured dusty technical libraries for any insight that might improve gunnery. Captain Robert Williams, assigned to the 8th Air Force's Gunnery Analysis Section, unearthed Puckle's 1924 paper in the archives at Wright Field. He read it in one sitting, then drafted a memo to his commanding officer, underlining just 2 words 3 times. He understood immediately. Puckle had foreseen this very catastrophe 18 years before the first B-17 flew combat over Europe. The calculations held true, the warnings were sound, and yet hundreds of American airmen had already paid the price for the Army's inattention. Whether Puckle was right was never in doubt. The math proved that beyond question. The real issue was whether a solution existed. Expecting gunners to calculate deflection angles consciously under fire was absurd. No human mind could handle trigonometry at battle speed. Yet, if deliberate calculation was impossible, perhaps there was another way to achieve the same result. By the summer of 1940, the British were already seeking answers born of sheer necessity. RAF Squadron 609, operating Spitfires from Middle Wallop, faced a gunnery dilemma eerily similar to what American bomber crews would confront 2 years later. The pilots were fearless, their aircraft superb, yet their aim failed them. Reviewing gun camera footage from July dogfights, Flight Lieutenant John Dundas found that hits against crossing Messerschmitt Bf 109s averaged a mere 6%, just 6 rounds out of every 100. With only about 16 seconds of ammunition for continuous fire, pilots often emptied their guns entirely, only to watch the enemy slip away unharmed. In early August 1940, amid the intensity of the Battle of Britain, Squadron Leader Horace Darley of 609 Squadron took a bold and controversial step. He grounded his entire unit for 3 days, halting vital combat operations to conduct live-fire trials that flagrantly defied RAF training regulations. Before the war, Darley had been a skilled clay pigeon shooter, attuned to the subtle art of anticipating moving targets. He recognized that expert marksmen didn't rely on calculations. They reacted instinctively, their minds and bodies synchronizing seamlessly with the target's motion. Darley speculated whether fighter pilots could cultivate a similar intuitive reflex, trusting instinct over formula to strike swiftly and accurately in the chaos of aerial combat. Darley's experiment was striking in its simplicity. A Hurricane towed a target banner across the gunnery range while his Spitfire pilots executed repeated firing passes. But instead of following the standard procedure, carefully aiming and calculating precise lead angles, he gave instructions that seemed almost reckless. Don't aim. Pilots were told to focus entirely on the target's motion, allowing their eyes to track its path as their aircraft turned to follow. The act of deflection was to arise naturally from the movement of the plane, rather than from conscious adjustment to the sights. They fired not at where the target appeared, but where their instincts predicted it would be, letting intuition, timing, and the plane's momentum guide their rounds to the mark. The method relied on trust and reflex over calculation, transforming instinct into deadly accuracy. The initial attempts were chaotic. Pilots consistently overshot the banner by 50 feet, their rounds stitching wide arcs across empty sky. Yet, Darley insisted they continue. 40 passes each, repeated over 3 relentless days. There were no lectures on ballistics, no trigonometry, no charts of lead angles. The sole instruction was simple: fire while still in motion, not after settling the sights on the target. Slowly, a transformation began. By the third day, hit rates started to rise, not dramatically but noticeably. What had been 6% climbed to around 12%. That modest improvement was profound. Twice as many rounds striking German aircraft, producing twice the number of kills, or at minimum, twice the damage that grounded enemy planes, preventing them from flying future missions. Repetition and instinct, not theory, had rewritten the rules of aerial gunnery. Darley compiled his findings and forwarded them to Fighter Command Headquarters on August 18, 1940. In his report, he emphasized a striking discovery. The pilots who showed the greatest improvement were not the best shots on the practice range, but those capable of overriding their instinct to aim deliberately. These men learned to rely instead on peripheral vision and an intuitive feel for motion. Darley argued that the conscious mind was far too slow to process the dynamics of high-speed aerial combat. The real key, he wrote, was conditioning the subconscious to manage deflection instinctively. Just as a seasoned baseball player tracks a fly ball's arc and positions himself perfectly beneath it without ever calculating angles or velocity. Victory in the skies, Darley concluded, depended on trained instinct, not deliberate precision. Fighter Command distributed Darley's report across the service, but its adoption was uneven at best. A handful of squadrons embraced the new method with enthusiasm, convinced by its simplicity and promise. Others dismissed it outright, labeling it reckless and devoid of scientific rigor. The most resistance came from the RAF's training establishment, where instructors steeped in decades of traditional marksmanship sought Darley's concept as heresy, a rejection of everything they believed about disciplined shooting. Yet the numbers told a different story. Units that practiced motion-based deflection firing consistently achieved higher kill ratios during the closing months of 1940. The improvement was undeniable. By the spring of 1941, even without formal acknowledgement in manuals or doctrine, Darley's technique had quietly taken root, shaping a new generation of fighter pilots who trusted instinct over calculation. American observers stationed in Britain carefully documented Darley's revolutionary training techniques, but when the United States Army Air Forces attempted to apply them, they encountered a fundamental obstacle. Fighter pilots could internalize deflection shooting through repetition, allowing instinct and motion to guide their aim, but bomber crews had no such advantage. A Spitfire pilot could weave, bank, and roll, using his aircraft's movement to generate natural lead. A B-17 waist gunner, by contrast, was trapped within a vibrating fuselage, fixed to a station as the bomber droned straight and level through bursts of flak. He couldn't maneuver, couldn't use his body or aircraft motion to help anticipate an enemy's path. With nothing but his hands on the gun and his eyes tracking a target streaking by at hundreds of miles per hour, instinct wasn't enough. If human reflexes failed, Darley's logic suggested, the answer had to be mechanical. Enter MIT's radiation laboratory, where Division 7 was formed in early 1942. The radiation label was deliberate camouflage, evoking atomic work to conceal the division's true mission, developing advanced fire control systems. Leading the effort was Dr. Charles Stark Draper, a 40-year-old engineer whose career had focused on gyroscopic navigation instruments. Draper recognized the core of the problem wasn't marksmanship, but forecasting. A gunner needed information about where a target would be when the bullets arrived, not where it sat at the instant of firing. That insight reframed the challenge. Rather than teaching humans to outthink time and motion, the solution lay in machines that could compute lead instantly, compensating for speed, angle, range, and platform motion. Division 7 set out to turn prediction into a display, an aiming cue that projected the target's future position into the gunner's sight. So mechanical calculation, not frail human intuition, would determine whether rounds met metal or merely tore through empty air. By July 1943, Draper's team unveiled the prototype of the Mark 14 computing gunsight, a device that looked more like something from a pulp science fiction magazine than a piece of wartime hardware. It combined a reflector sight with a gyroscopic computer housed in a 28-pound assembly that drew power directly from the aircraft's electrical system. To operate it, the gunner adjusted a dial until a pair of calibration marks aligned with the enemy aircraft's wingspan, providing the system with precise range data. Once set, he would track the target for about 2 seconds, keeping it centered within a small, illuminated ring. In that brief window, the gyroscope recorded the target's angular velocity, its rate of movement across the sight's field of view. Those measurements allowed the sight to predict where the target would be when the bullets arrived, effectively turning mathematical calculation into an instantaneous visual cue for deadly accuracy. This is where the Mark 14 truly astonished. Inside its 28-pound housing, a network of cams, gears, and machined metal components functioned as a fully analog computer, solving the deflection problem in real time. It combined the range set by the gunner, the target's angular velocity measured by the gyroscope, and the known ballistics of the .50 caliber round to calculate precisely where the guns needed to lead the target. The solution appeared as a luminous reticle, seemingly suspended in space ahead of the aircraft. The gunner no longer aimed at the enemy plane itself. He followed the glowing dot. If his range setting was correct and his tracking smooth, the dot indicated exactly where the bullets would intersect the target. What would take a human brain minutes of complex calculation was performed instantaneously, and the sight updated continuously 30 times per second, adjusting for shifts in angle, speed, and distance. The Mark 14 transformed gunnery from a test of guesswork and reflex into a system of precise, real-time mechanical prediction. Testing at the Naval Air Station in Norfolk, Virginia, during August 1943 yielded astonishing results. Gunners who had previously struggled to achieve more than a 5% hit rate on crossing targets suddenly recorded 18% accuracy on their very first day using the Mark 14. With just a week of familiarization and practice, their success rates climbed beyond 25%. This dramatic improvement, essentially 5 times better than traditional manual aiming, translated directly into a massive increase in combat effectiveness, allowing crews to damage or destroy 5 times as many enemy aircraft during each engagement. The results confirmed that the Mark 14 was not just innovative, it was revolutionary. Rolling out tens of thousands of Mark 14 sights across the bomber force, however, was not instantaneous. Mass production didn't ramp up until early 1944, and priority went to new aircraft coming off the lines rather than refitting the older crews already in combat. As a result, most gunners flying missions through late 1943 and into 1944 still relied on rudimentary iron sights or simple reflector sights with no computing power. They needed an immediate, practical fix, something deployable right away that didn't demand electrical alterations or lengthy retrofits. In short, they required a method that could be used with the gear already bolted into their ships. A procedural change or low-tech aid that would boost hit rates now, rather than a high-tech device they'd have to wait months to receive. The breakthrough didn't come from laboratories or engineers, but from the gunners in the field, particularly in the Pacific, where clear skies and longer engagement ranges made observation easier than over Europe's clouded battlefields. Staff Sergeant William Bill Fleming, a waist gunner assigned to the USS Lexington's Air Group support staff, had by March 1944 completed 31 combat missions and survived the loss of 4 aircraft. Fleming wasn't an officer, held no college degree, and couldn't explain gyroscopic precession if pressed, but had fired roughly 40,000 rounds in combat and personally observed hits on 7 enemy planes. More importantly, he had kept meticulous notes, recording patterns, techniques, and observations from each engagement. His hands-on experience and careful record-keeping would provide insights far beyond what theoretical training could offer, turning raw combat experience into the foundation for practical improvements that gunners could implement immediately. Fleming's notebook held something extraordinary. Detailed sketches of enemy aircraft with hand-drawn lines projecting forward from their noses, marking exactly where he had aimed during successful attacks. He quantified these leads by comparing them to the enemy plane's length, 2 lengths ahead, 3 lengths ahead, turning instinct into measurable data. On March 14, 1944, Fleming brought his notebook to Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare during a routine debriefing. O'Hare, already a Medal of Honor recipient and one of the Navy's most respected tacticians, immediately recognized its significance. Here was empirical deflection data, meticulously recorded under the unforgiving conditions of real combat. It wasn't theory or classroom calculation. It was proof of what actually worked in the sky, providing a foundation that could be transformed into practical guidance for every gunner still struggling with the deadly challenge of leading high-speed targets. O'Hare directed Fleming to take the technique straight to the crews. No chalkboard theory, only hands-on practice aboard the carrier. Fleming's drills, soon dubbed the spot shooting method, positioned gunners at their stations while a shipmate paraded a model aircraft on a pole across the flight deck. As the mock enemy passed at different angles and speeds, Fleming instructed each gunner to aim ahead by a simple, repeatable measure. 1 aircraft length for shallow crossing angles, 2 lengths for moderate crosses, and 3 or more for steep beam passes. The exercise turned an abstract lead calculation into a tactile habit. Count forward in plane lengths from the enemy's nose, then fire. These visual, muscle memory cues were easy to teach, quick to memorize, and instantly applicable in combat, exactly what crews needed when electrical computing sites weren't available. Within hours, the gunners were trading formulas for practical rules of thumb, replacing paralysis by calculation with a straightforward, battlefield-ready technique. The Lexington's gunnery officer, cautious yet eager for any improvement, approved controlled testing during the carrier's operations off Truck Lagoon in late March 1944. He compiled ammunition usage and confirmed hit records for the previous 8 weeks, then monitored the same data after Fleming's spot shooting program was introduced. The outcome was striking. Before the training, gunners averaged only 4.2 confirmed hits per 100 rounds against crossing targets. 6 weeks into the program, by the end of April, that figure had surged to 9.1 hits per 100 rounds. The simple visual method had more than doubled the air group's effectiveness, transforming gunners from struggling marksmen into significantly more lethal operators. The results validated Fleming's approach and demonstrated that practical, combat-tested techniques could achieve dramatic improvements even without advanced computing sites or complex instrumentation. News of Fleming's spot shooting method traveled rapidly through the Pacific Fleet. By May 1944, adaptations of the technique were being taught aboard the carriers Essex, Enterprise, and Bunker Hill. Each ship's gunnery officers introduced small refinements, yet the fundamental principle remained intact. Provide gunners with a straightforward visual system linked to the target's apparent size, removing the need for complex mental calculations. A gunner didn't have to consciously account for the fractions of a second it took a bullet to reach its mark. Instead, he simply remembered the rule: 3 aircraft lengths ahead for a crossing target, and fired. This practical, instinct-driven approach allowed crews to translate theory into consistent, effective results under the pressure of combat, dramatically improving hit rates without additional technology or instrumentation. The effectiveness of the technique stemmed from its alignment with how human vision and cognition naturally operate. Our brains excel at judging relative size, but struggle to estimate absolute distances. Telling a gunner to lead a target by 50 feet was meaningless when he had no sense of what 50 feet looked like at 300 yards. By contrast, instructing him to lead by 2 aircraft lengths provided an instant, intuitive reference. The enemy plane itself became a built-in measuring tool. The gunner simply projected that distance forward into open air and fired. This visual, instinct-driven method bypassed complex calculations, allowing rapid, accurate aiming under the stress of combat, and leveraging natural perceptual abilities to dramatically improve hit rates. By mid-1944, the Army Air Forces had implemented comparable training methods, labeling it radius of action shooting. Instructional manuals began featuring diagrams that illustrated proper lead distances using multiples of a target's wingspan or fuselage as reference points. At the 8th Air Force Gunnery School in Lavina, England, the entire curriculum was overhauled in June 1944 to incorporate this approach. While mission losses remained serious, the improvements were tangible. By July 1944, bomber losses per sortie had dropped to 3.4 to 4%, down from 5.2% the previous October. That reduction translated into hundreds of aircrew who survived missions they might previously have perished on, a profound testament to the life-saving impact of intuitive, visually guided deflection training. Understanding the method and applying it in the heat of battle proved to be two very different things. Even when gunners memorized the spot shooting rules, their brains often betrayed them once rounds began to fly. Psychologists attached to the Army Air Forces documented this clearly during 1944 interviews with returning crews. The problem was not ignorance. Airmen could recite lead distances perfectly during debriefs. The breakdown occurred under acute stress, when conscious calculations collapsed and a more primitive reflex took over, point at the danger. Training had to overcome that automatic reaction, turning a learned rule into reflexive behavior that held up under fear, noise, and motion. Only then would the visual lead cues translate reliably into improved hit rates in real engagements. Captain Harold Klein, an Army psychologist at Bovington, investigated this phenomenon by examining gun camera footage alongside post-mission interviews. He identified a consistent behavioral pattern he called threat fixation collapse. Initially, gunners maintained correct deflection aiming, but as the enemy fighter drew nearer and perceived danger escalated, their aim gradually slipped backward, often ending up aimed directly at, or even behind, the target. Klein's research revealed that this breakdown was most pronounced during head-on attacks, where closing speeds exceeded 500 miles per hour and gunners had barely 2 seconds before incoming fire. In these moments of extreme stress, trained technique evaporated, replaced by raw instinct. Focus on the immediate threat and fire, abandoning rational calculations in favor of reflexive survival responses. The solution lay in relentless repetition, drilling deflection shooting until it became instinctive, processed by the brain like walking or catching a ball rather than conscious calculation. In 1942 and 1943, the military simply lacked the time to achieve this level of automaticity. By late 1944, however, as Allied air superiority grew and training pipelines stabilized, gunnery schools expanded their programs. Courses that had lasted 4 weeks in 1942 stretched to 8, then 10 weeks. Trainees now fired 5,000 rounds during training instead of just 1,000. And crucially, more than half of these rounds were fired at moving targets, simulating realistic combat speeds, giving students practical experience that finally bridged the gap between classroom instruction and survival in the skies. At Jacksonville, Florida, the Naval Air Gunner School introduced an exceptionally effective training regimen in August 1944. Trainees operated 50 caliber guns mounted on motorized turrets capable of rapid rotation and elevation, while high-speed boats dragged targets across the water at up to 60 miles per hour, varying distance and crossing angles unpredictably. Gunners fired repeatedly, completing 50 to 70 passes per day until leading targets became instinctive. Instructors refrained from giving verbal corrections, allowing students to observe their hit patterns, make small adjustments, and fire again. This iterative process taught the subconscious far more efficiently than conscious instruction ever could, embedding the principles of deflection, shooting so deeply that precise lead became automatic, even under the stress and chaos of real combat conditions. Analysis of combat footage revealed a striking pattern among elite gunners who had flown 30 or more missions. Despite facing extreme stress, their deflection aim points remained precise and consistent. When FW-190 tore through the formation, guns blazing, these seasoned airmen maintained accurate lead instinctively. Their conscious minds might have been gripped by fear, many later admitting they were certain death was imminent in several encounters. Yet their hands followed the correct sight picture flawlessly. This mastery reflected a state akin to the martial arts concept of mushin, or no mind, where skill operates independently of conscious thought. Years of repetition, high-pressure experience, and relentless training had encoded the mechanics into their subconscious, allowing them to execute complex actions perfectly while their minds wrestled with terror. Achieving that level of mastery demanded time and ammunition few gunners ever saw. The arithmetic of wartime preparation was unforgiving. Developing an expert in deflection shooting required roughly 5,000 rounds and 10 weeks of concentrated practice. Yet the bomber campaign needed 50,000 trained gunners within just 6 months. The result was unavoidable compromise. Most airmen never reached true unconscious competence. They lingered in the stage of conscious skill, able to execute proper deflection when circumstances permitted deliberate focus, but highly susceptible to failure under intense stress or sudden, unforeseen combat scenarios. The gulf between ideal training and operational reality remained a persistent and deadly challenge. This produced an uneven distribution of combat effectiveness within bomber formations. Defensive firepower varied dramatically depending on the individual gunners assigned to each position on each aircraft. A group containing several seasoned veterans with extensive training and combat experience could repel assaults that would overwhelm a formation composed mainly of inexperienced crews. German fighter pilots quickly recognized and exploited these disparities, focusing their attacks on bombers that exhibited hesitant or imprecise fire during initial passes. They deliberately avoided formations where defensive gunners responded instantly, with concentrated and accurately aimed fire, knowing that such coordinated resistance greatly increased the risk of losing their aircraft during the engagement. The revolution in deflection shooting that began with British trials and American necessity did not end with the close of World War II in 1945. The fundamental insight that gunners must aim where a target will be, not where it appears, became the cornerstone of all subsequent weapons development. The Mark 14 computing gun sight progressed into the Mark 18, which remained in service through the Korean War and eventually gave way to digital fire control systems capable of processing dozens of variables instantly. By the Vietnam era, fighter jets were equipped with radar-assisted gun systems that automatically calculated deflection, leaving pilots responsible only for keeping the target within the acquisition window. The 4 Phantoms lead computing optical sight executed in microseconds what Draper's mechanical gyroscopes had required substantial fractions of a second to accomplish. Contemporary air-to-air combat has largely rendered traditional gunnery obsolete, as missiles now intercept targets at distances where lead must be calculated in miles rather than feet. Yet the fundamental physics remain unchanged. Only the method has evolved. An AM-120 AMRAAM, for example, employs inertial guidance combined with active radar to continually adjust its flight path, computing deflection thousands of times per second. Similarly, the F-22 Raptor's APG-77 radar doesn't merely track enemy aircraft. It predicts their future positions based on real-time velocity and acceleration data, then optimally positions the fighter and selects appropriate weapons. This modern precision mirrors the challenge William Fleming confronted in 1944 with hand-drawn sketches, now executed by high-speed computers performing calculations at teraflop scales rather than relying on human gunners measuring plane lengths. Surprisingly, the basics of deflection shooting still appear in modern fighter training. Even though guns are now a tertiary option, elite programs like the Navy Fighter Weapons School, Top Gun, keep live-fire guns-only exercises in the syllabus. Not because instructors expect widespread cannon duels, but because the skill sharpens spatial intuition. Learning to anticipate where maneuvering aircraft will be a half-second from now builds an internal model of closure rates, angle off, and pursue geometry that applies across every engagement. That mental picture helps a pilot judge when to punch missiles into the firing envelope, how to position for a merge, and when to break off to avoid a trap. In short, mastering visual lead develops situational awareness that transcends the weapon. Whether the tool is a .50 caliber or an AIM-120, the pilot who sees the fight before it happens gains a decisive edge. The principles of deflection shooting reach far beyond aviation, applying wherever high-speed targets must be engaged. Modern automated air defense systems, ranging from the Phalanx CIWS safeguarding naval vessels to the CRAM protecting forward operating bases, embody the same problem that 1943 bomber gunners faced, only executed with extraordinary speed and precision. The Phalanx, for example, fires up to 4,500 rounds per minute, roughly 75 rounds every second, while its radar continuously calculates target movement and updates the aiming solution in real time. Essentially, it performs the split-second deflection adjustments that men like Eddie Kowalski had to make over the Solomon Islands, eliminating the human hesitation that once proved fatal and translating those wartime lessons into technology capable of intercepting threats far faster than any individual could manage. Even modern combat simulators rely on the same deflection principles that challenged World War II gunners. Players are forced to aim not at where the target sits, but at where it will be by the time their shot arrives. Titles like War Thunder and Digital Combat Simulator make this requirement explicit, and newcomers quickly experience the familiar frustration of watching rounds sail harmlessly past their moving opponents. Success demands internalizing the concept of leading targets, transforming conscious effort into instinctive action. Experienced players achieve a level of automaticity strikingly similar to that of seasoned combat veterans. Their hands adjust aim fluidly, their decisions happening below conscious thought, replicating the reflexive mastery once forged under fire in real aerial engagements. The leap from barely 4% hit rates in early 1943 to over 20% by late 1944 stands as one of World War II's most remarkable tactical turnarounds. This achievement wasn't the result of cutting-edge hardware or overwhelming force, but the careful alignment of training with human perception and cognition. Countless airmen who might have perished continued flying, while enemy fighters that once slipped away were now destroyed, and bombing missions that could have faltered succeeded. The breakthrough came from recognizing that instinct alone could mislead. Survival depended on teaching crews to override natural impulses, to trust proven principles of motion and trajectory, and to act in accordance with physics rather than fear. The gunners who mastered the art of aiming into empty space, trusting their rounds would strike an unseen target, revealed a profound truth about human adaptability under extreme stress. We're not bound by instinct alone. With clear understanding, disciplined practice, and the urgency of survival, people can retrain their responses to align with reality rather than expecting reality to conform to intuition. This hard-earned lesson, forged in the skies over Europe and the Pacific, continues to hold relevance wherever humans face situations in which instinct and correct action diverge, proving that training and awareness can overcome even our most deeply ingrained reflexes.